So we're in this section of Paul covering issues that he has heard about in the church at Corinth. This is a church he's visited at least a couple of times at this point, and he's had correspondence with this church. But somewhere in this correspondence, he has learned of issues that are happening in the church, and he heard of issues of division. He heard of issues of impurity, and he heard of issues. We'll talk about next class, or John will talk about. Heard of issues in their understanding of the resurrection. But he also heard about issues in their worship, and so that's the section of Scripture that we're going to touch on this morning. Before we begin, Ryan, you mind to start us with a word of prayer?
Dear Father, we humbly come before you this time, and we're grateful that we can gather together this morning. We just pray that you'll bless this hour, that you'll bless Michael, the lesson that he's prepared for us, and will open our minds and our hearts to that lesson and be benefited from it. We pray that we will be better servants for you each and every day, Father. And it's to you.
Amen. Thank you. As I mentioned, I won't be here Wednesday, and John will tackle most of Lesson 8. I don't know if we'll get there at all this morning or not, but he'll tackle that. And Ron is jealous because he's getting like way more notice than you got. Doesn't seem fair. But I'm sure he'll do a great job. So we touched on the first text in the study, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and I want to begin there just briefly. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, this section that we hear pretty often in our worship, because it's a pretty common reading during the time of communion. We read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 17, somewhere between 17 and 34. Some section of that passage gets read during the Lord's Supper. And we talked about on Wednesday that the effect of the Lord's Supper in Corinth was that everybody was worse off for being there. And that is a pretty damning comment to make about worship. And that's exactly what Paul told them, and we compared that to the worship in Malachi. And I left Wednesday with a question for your consideration, and it's based on verse 20. And so we'll start there, and admittedly, we're going to touch on a couple of unusual or sensitive topics this morning. So we'll dive into this with grace, because I'm confident that I don't have all the answers. 1 Corinthians 11:20. When you come together, it's not the Lord's Supper that you are eating. Or your version may say it's impossible for you to eat the Lord's Supper, or it's not the Lord's Supper that you're partaking of. There's different versions of how that verse is rendered in different translations. So it's clear that what they were eating was not the Lord's Supper, at least it's what Paul said. So what were they eating? And that was a question that we left with on Wednesday. Any comments or thoughts about what does Paul mean there? What were they eating in Corinth?
It sounds like a meal, because on down he says, can you not eat at your home?
Correct. So Carol notes that it seems pretty obvious from the context that there's a lot more than a little bit of cracker and a little bit of wine involved in what the Corinthians were eating. Note that he said, do you have your own houses to eat in? And what condition were some getting to based on their meal in Corinth? Some were overeating, some were drunk. Clearly, we're talking about more than the communion that the Lord established. So what were they eating? They were eating a meal. And is there any precedent for that? Like, where does this come from? Did anybody have any opportunity to find that in their studies about what this could have been? No question. So, and remember that the institution of the Lord's Supper itself, go back to any of the Gospels, the institution of the Lord's Supper itself, was it a standalone event separate from any other meal? No, I mean, it absolutely came at the end of a meal. It's pretty clear. Jesus was eating with his disciples the Passover meal, and at the end of that meal, he instituted the Lord's Supper. And there is quite a bit of evidence from not just here in Corinth, but from other places in the New Testament and lots of early church writings, that this idea of having a meal as part of the worship was not uncommon. There was and you see this word pop up occasionally in even modern churches. Anybody familiar with the term I'm thinking about here? What's that?
I'm not sure.
Well, you do see this stuff pop up in some religious groups, a love feast or an agape meal or an agape feast. That you see that term pop up, and that was a term that a lot of, again, early church fathers talk about this being part of the worship. In fact, in Jude, and the book of Jude is a strange little animal. I don't want to dive too deeply into everything about the book of Jude, but you'll notice that Jude uses this term in talking about the impact of false teachers in the book of Jude in verse 12. And I think most all of our translations will render this the same way. It says, these are hidden reefs, or these are blemishes on your love feasts. They feast with you without fear, shepherds feeding themselves, waterless clouds swept about by the winds, and he goes on to describe them further. And so Jude references that, again, seemed to be not uncommon for there to be a common meal followed by the communion that the Lord instituted. So I guess the question is, what happened to this? And why? I think maybe Corinth gives us a pretty good, template or clue as to what happened. So what happened in Corinth to this meal?
I think we talked about some on Wednesday that a lot of this is about the division that was going on.
Yes.
And it was the rich versus poor, and those that had versus those that had not, and it was just being abused and
Yes.
making it more divisive than it had been.
Yes.
And so clearly Paul says that's wrong. We don't need that anymore. So,
Yes.
So that may be one of the reasons that it
So,
went away.
yeah, so it was becoming so abused and becoming so divisive that, and you could, again, from what you can learn, and these things are not, authorized, definitive text, but what you can learn from these other church fathers is it wasn't too much longer that the communion was completely divided from this idea, and at some point these feasts ultimately went away. And perhaps it's because of this very thing that's happening in Corinth that this became such a point of contention, so abused and so divisive that it was harming the larger point of the worship. And here in Corinth clearly was. And as Dad noted, what were the specific issues that came about from the abuse of this meal?
Social inequities and a lack of sharing, a lack of, it was just a lot of selfishness. And it appears as though, too, that certain particular groups may have brought food amongst themselves and indulged themselves, not even thinking anybody else that could come.
Yes. And so, again, from what we can tell, what it appears that this idea of kind of a communal sharing time became very selfish. It became just a series of private meals. You brought your own stuff and you ate your own stuff, and the whole idea of the original intent was completely lost. So I think that concept in the background, if we kind of understand that was not uncommon, but that concept in the background helps me understand what Paul is saying in some of these verses when he says, "Do you not have houses to eat and drink in?" Well, what does that mean then in that context? What do we think Paul means when he says, "Do you not have houses to eat and drink in?"
That you should do that kind of eating and partying in your home.
So look, if this is just going to turn into private parties, you got houses to do that in. That's pretty clear, I think, from the context. It's the abuse of the larger meal that causes Paul to make that comment. And perhaps the irony of that is, where was this church in Corinth likely meeting?
That's the irony. It was in a house.
Yeah, it was very, very likely in a house. And so this is not like a prohibition from eating in your home. Like, obviously, this is probably where they're meeting. But the larger point is the abuse of this meal, guys. If this is just going to be private dining for you and the things that you've brought, do that at your house. Like, this doesn't have anything to do with worship, what's happening here in Corinth. And in fact, it's, as he would note, this is undermining the worship that is happening. This is making the worship that is happening unfruitful. So I think that kind of understanding that tradition of that time and that context, again, helps me understand some of the things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11. And so, thoughts or comments about that before we move on?
It wasn't a potluck then, it wasn't equally shared.
I think that originally that was designed to be, Carol. At least that's my understanding. And her question was this kind of a potluck thing? I think that originally it was designed to be, but clearly it had turned into into something that it wasn't. And so, yeah, again, everybody's bringing their own stuff. The poor are showing up hoping to share, and there's nothing there for them. Nobody's sharing with them, and it's very divisive. Some are leaving before others show up. It's clearly a mess. And that had such a negative impact on the rest of the worship that Paul says this whole idea probably needs to get scuttled in favor of focusing on the communion or the Lord's Supper, which he begins kind of in verse 23. It says, now look, here's what we need to be focusing on. And then he recounts what happened in that upper room, which I think is interesting. I think this is the focus. The rest of this can really fall away, and over time I think that's what we saw. And the effect, and we noted this last time, the effect is verse 30, because they had so mishandled this whole communion and eating, that some of them were weak and ill and some have died. And I think that great majority of readers would agree that that's a spiritual sickness and death. But you can imagine if you were a poor Corinthian and you came to this service where there was going to be a potluck, and you looked around and everybody was eating and staring at you and nobody shared with you, and they went on with their service and they left without talking to you, would that be somewhere that you wanted to continue to worship? And so they had effectively ostracized these poor Corinthians. It makes perfect sense to me that some are weak and ill and some have died. They just quit showing up. Again, I think in that context that probably makes sense. So there's a lot of issues going on here in Corinth. We often talk about this as abuse of the Lord's Supper. This is really an abuse of the worship in general, I think, more accurately, what's happening here in 1 Corinthians 11. Additional thoughts or comments about that?
Just a couple of other thoughts. First of all, there wasn't another church for them to go to. This was the only church. And also, there was no separation of church and state. So the official religion of the state was paganism at this point.
Yes.
So, among Christians meeting, we know they met in towns and various areas. You have to think about how fast the church grew at this moment.
Yes.
Persecution was coming in. This was an event that, unlike, I think we maybe think, well, they're meeting for a couple hours like we do. There's no question they met probably for the most part all day. So it was practical for them to have foods there and have that. And so I think historically we know, number one, they didn't meet for an hour or two. And they were meeting probably often, maybe even every other day or every day.
Yes.
So it's just a completely different environment. They couldn't go to the church down the street.
Right. Yeah, good points. And you certainly see that, if you go to Acts chapter 20, you can see that when Paul met with the brethren there at Troas, there were hours and hours of worship involved there. I don't know that we shouldn't probably lay that over and try to compare it exactly, but I think it's an example of what you're talking about. Just think about the culture of the time and where some of these brethren were gathering in from many different lifestyles and backgrounds and occupations. The first day of the week was not a day off for the slaves in Corinth. You got to remember that also. So when were they actually meeting? What time of day? Just the culture would have made their entire meeting environment very different in a lot of ways than what we experience here. Now, as we talk about as we move on, kind of the core kind of fundamental things that were part of their worship are very similar, but the way that those things happened and the culture they were in made it very different in a lot of ways also. Other thoughts there before we move on? Let's go to the next question. So I'm going to go to the third bullet question kind of in the list there. And I noted last time the second text for study at the top of the page should be 1 Corinthians 14. And so I'm going to turn to 1 Corinthians 14 as we kind of talk about the next couple of questions. 1 Corinthians 14 and talk about this third bullet. What should be the effect of worship? So based on these passages, what should be the effect of worship? Build up the church. And I think you certainly see that in 1 Corinthians 14, the end of verse 26. Again, we're clearly in a worship context here in 1 Corinthians 14. When you come together, first part of verse 26, let all things be done for edification, or let all things be done for building up. So the effect of worship should be the strengthening of the church. Based on what we've read, is that automatic? Is that guaranteed? Certainly not. Paul has already told them that when you come together, you're not being built up. You're being torn down. Like, you're weaker for what the things that are happening. So this is not a guarantee. Just because we happen to pile into a building together doesn't mean that we're going to be strengthened. So what, in general, what was happening in Corinth and what could happen to us today that would cause the effect of our worship not to be our building up?
There was mass confusion. There was people speaking in tongues. There was without interpreters, and there was lots going on that just a disrupted service.
Mass confusion is a pretty good term. And that kind of speaks, if you want to skip down to the last bullet question on that page, is how would we describe in general the worship in Corinth? And maybe it's a good time to skip to that question. How would we describe that worship? One would be confusing. Though there's definitely evidence of multiple people talking at the same time, whether in the native tongue or in some unknown tongue. There's a lot, not just that there were tongues spoken with no interpreter, so that'd be confusing enough, but multiple people talking at the same time. Again, it seems clear that that's going on. How else would you describe worship in Corinth? It was not Christ-centered. Who did it seem to be centered on, Carol? Yeah, it seemed to be a little self-centered. And I think all in the background of 1 Corinthians 14, at least I get the sense that Paul throughout this chapter is trying, and again, remember, Paul's walking this line of trying to encourage the faithful, but rebuke the ones that are unfaithful. There certainly seems to be those who are trying to elevate themselves with their spiritual gift, whether that's true or false. And I think there's some indication that some are faking the gift of tongues here. I think that undercurrent is also running through 1 Corinthians 14. And why would you fake a spiritual gift? Make yourself look good. That's exactly right. Yes. So why would you fake a spiritual gift? Is so there is a perceived spirituality, a perceived heightened enlightenment, a perceived a higher level of spirituality. And so, again, I think that undercurrent's run through 1 Corinthians 14. So, as Carol says, the worship there had become look at these gifts I have, rather than a Christ-centered. So we've got confusion, we've got arrogance. If I could kind of summarize that, how else would you describe the worship in Corinth?
Disorderly.
It was clearly disorderly.
Some reading, some were not, some had, some didn't. Very chaotic.
Chaotic is a great word. That's actually one that I had written down. And remember, laid over top of all this is they were coming and going at different times. Some were leaving before others showed up, and some had already taken the Lord's Supper, and some hadn't. Some were eating this meal, and some didn't have anything to eat. And they were coming and going and speaking in tongues, and multiple people. Chaotic. They did not have an order of service printed in the bulletin, I assure you. Like, it was so far different than kind of the way we would expect a worship service to be organized. So chaotic is definitely a word. So we got chaotic, we got confusing, and we've got arrogant. Anybody want to add to the list? Lack of leadership. So this is one that John has touched on a few times. Like, it doesn't seem like anybody's steering the boat here. And there's one more. Thank you. And there's one more I would add that I think maybe overlay all of this is it was still divisive. It was still divided. And can you imagine how that division would play into all these other issues? So remember, how are they kind of dividing themselves? According to what they have, one. But all the way back to chapter 1 was another way they were dividing themselves. Who they followed, right? And so if I am a follower, again, put this in context. If I'm a follower of Paul, and I've got this little clique of my Paul followers, but there's a follower of Apollos and then a follower of Peter, and a follower of Apollos gets up and starts speaking in tongues and starts generating some, starts getting some attention. Somebody over here that's a follower of Paul said, I'm not going to let that guy get the attention. He's in the Apollos group. I'm going to stand up and start. So you can, anyway, I can just imagine how the divisiveness further leads to the chaos because nobody wants the other group to get the upper hand in the prophecy or the tongues or the revelations or whatever they were purporting to have. And how many of those spiritual gifts were legitimate, I think is an open question, but clearly these different groups all wanted to be seen as having them. So we got this chaotic, divisive, confusing, arrogant worship with no leadership. Yes, sir.
I think it's interesting, hear all these things that he lists there in verse 26. None of those things are inherently wrong. None of those things are bad.
Yes.
But the problem comes in the heart that they're presented with. And, if someone brings a hymn, wonderful. Someone has a lesson they want to give, great. A revelation, a tongue, whatever. But when that comes with, no, we're going to sing my hymn.
Yes.
Right now.
Yes.
Or you're going to listen to my lesson. And there's no thought to organization or consideration of anybody else. It's my way or else.
Yes.
Then you just start sowing division for your own selfish purpose.
No question. Even imagine in a service of ours, we're in a large building, and again, we've divided up into cliques, and John starts leading a song over here, and we're a little bit jealous that John's song sounds pretty good, so we're going to start leading a different song over here and try to gather a following over here, and we're trying to sing each other. Again, all of these issues at Corinth feed on themselves. The division led to more chaos, which led to more division, which led to more confusion, which led to people wanting to have more spiritual gifts, or at least display, pretending they had those gifts. I just think all these things feed on themselves until you've got this absolute dumpster fire of a so-called worship that's happening in Corinth.
It seems unintentional, thoughtless. Like, the things that God asks for don't happen by accident. Unity doesn't happen by accident. Orderly worship doesn't happen by accident. Leadership doesn't happen by accident. Everything that God asks of us requires thought and preparation and some kind of planning that goes beyond just what I want. And so it just seems like it's just unintentional. Kind of like we're going to show up to church and see what happens. And you can imagine if we did that on Sunday morning, what it would look like. Even if the end result was orderly, what it would look like trying to get there.
Yes. And I think about it struck me yesterday. Put yourself in the place of Paul, and you have taught these, a lot of these people you have taught, a lot of them you have seen converted. You're the one that kind of laid the foundation for the worship that happened in Corinth. And then you get this letter that reports this. How do you feel about that?
Michael, the overall thing is when you come, he makes it a point in one of the verses, when you take the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, you are sinning.
No question. Yeah, it's pretty blunt about that. And I think you can see, like, it just has to be very devastating to Paul to know that he's the one that, in a lot of ways, you know, the foundation of this church, he's the one that laid, if you allow me to use that. You know, obviously Jesus Christ is the foundation, and we all understand that. But the starting of this work, Paul is the one that taught them these fundamentals of worship and conversion. And then to go away and to hear that this is what it has devolved into, that has to be, you think, why is Paul so emotional in this letter, and why does he come across with some harsh comments? Like, this had to be really, really hard. Again, you can imagine how that would feel. So and the effect of this worship was they left more divisive, and some left ashamed. We know that. And some were leaving the faith. Some are weak and sick, and some have died. Like, their worship was making, every time they met, they got worse. Can you imagine if that was the case? Like, that is a brutal comment. That seems to be where we are.
You wonder what Paul was saying. You don't wonder. I mean, you're thinking they would agree. You'd be better off. He said this multiple times. You'd be better off. That's why. I mean, go to your own house. That's one. But he said other places, just you don't need to be here because, like you said, you could possibly grow more separately right now than you are by the things you're doing coming together. Which I think was the point. What used to be what he created in a fellowship, they have now it's now become something that's just actually causing further and further. Each one of them get further and further from God.
Yes.
By being together.
Yes.
I
And so, again, through the inspired pen of Paul, what a difficult task he has here. Rebuke the ones who need to be rebuked, encourage the one that needs to be encouraged, somehow create unity out of this chaos. Like, this is a really, really difficult letter. I think that's why we get more of Paul's emotion here than we do maybe in any other letter, because this is really, really hard. So we definitely see that. Yes, sir.
When reading this, I don't get any impression that these people weren't sincere about what they were doing, even though they were doing different things. Which means that we could conclude that sincerity, you can be sincerely wrong.
Yes.
And not be practicing what God's word teaches. Even sincerity of going to death almost.
Yeah, I think you can definitely reach that conclusion here. I might argue there may be some that weren't completely sincere, but I definitely agree with the larger point that there are some who were clearly trying to come and do the right thing and yet had lost their way. They were off the path. Now, they were coming with divisiveness and a lot of issues, but there were clearly those who were also coming trying to do things sincerely the right way. And so Paul trying to cultivate that and eliminate the other and unite the whole group all at the same time. But you can, to Wendell's point, you can come with the best of intentions, but get it completely wrong. I think that's certainly fair.
Sincerity of feeling like you're doing the right thing, and the arrogance of I'm always right can lead to that divisiveness too. If you believe that your mind can't be changed at what you believe is right, and you're sincere in that belief, it can lead to divisiveness.
Yes. And I don't want to dig into this, but I just go, I guess, throw it out that I'm blown away in the context of everything that we've talked about and what a mess that this place was, that Paul consistently, patiently, graciously addresses them all as brethren. I just think that is, like, he has not cut these guys off. I just think it's fascinating. Despite the gap between where he thinks they should be and where they are, consistently addresses them as brethren, and graciously and patiently is trying to bring them back. What's that?
False past, has anything to do with that? He feels for every Christian that was in a bad spot before they became a Christian.
Yeah.
Because he constantly just reminds us how bad he was off.
Yes.
Before they go back a little more sincerity in the wrong direction with Paul.
Yes.
I think he has so much heart for these people who are falling. He thinks he can bring them back to where he got this chance, this is like a chance he got.
Well said.
I was really impressed by reading 1 Corinthians 15. You laid the groundwork for I brought you the gospel, the good news, and then he just goes on, repeats this for them again.
Yes.
To try to get them where he thinks they should be
Yes.
in their maturity.
Yes.
But he still has a focus on yourself.
Yes. I think that's a great example of and Carol mentioned 1 Corinthians 15. He repeats things he's already told them, but patiently goes through the whole process again, step by step, in terms of the resurrection, which will be the topic for Wednesday night. That, just the grace and the patience required in all that process is pretty overwhelming. Okay, let's jump into deep water. 1 Corinthians 14, how are we to understand the command for women's silence in the church? If you studied 1 Corinthians 14, we are in verses 33 through 35. And I'll take a moment and read that passage. And certainly this is one that gets a lot of debate. And I don't know that we're going to solve the issue here this morning, but we're going to hopefully have a graceful discussion about it. God is not a God of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. The women should keep silent in the churches, for they're not permitted to speak, but should be in submission, as the law also says. If there's anything they desire to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in the assembly. Question is, how are we to understand that command? And I'll start wherever anybody wants to start on that one. Okay, I'll start. Okay, so whatever the issue here is, and Dad said headship, whatever the issue is here that we get to, Paul clearly has in mind that there is a submission issue at the core of it. Notice that's what he said in verse 34. They should be in submission as the law says. Was there anything in the Old Testament law about silence in any of the feasts or the assemblies for women that anybody is aware of? I'm not aware of that. So when he says as the law says, what's he referring to? Is he referring to silence in particular?
He's given precedent for this based on Old Testament principles.
Yes.
So there is going to be some reference here to creation.
Yes. But it's more about submission. Was that where you're headed?
Well, yeah, but I think it was though. I think among rabbis and among the Jews at that time, it was an absolute that women stay silent.
Okay.
Remain silent, and at least in the synagogue.
Yes.
But that doesn't answer your question. I think he is going to use, as opposed to other cultural things he's going to deal with, like a length of your hair. This one's going to be based on precedent. And the Old Testament goes on. So that's.
Yes. Okay, so let me start with this question. Is this, or should we read this as an absolute prohibition for any sound to come out of any female mouth within this building?
We're going to have a singing problem.
So that's the first thing that you run into clearly is we got to take all the scriptures and make sure we're making sense of all of them. And if this is an absolute prohibition of sound coming out of female mouths in worship, we got a singing problem. And so we can kind of set that aside. That is not, at least in my mind, again, I don't have the answers here. I'm just trying to sort through this with you people. It's that clearly that's not what we're dealing with. We can set that aside. We're not talking about an absolute prohibition of any of any sound, right? So that's one. Ms. Carol, did you have a comment?
Yes. I was very interested in this because I do speak up, and I'm very sorry if I speak out of turn. But I read this as this being a part of the confusion during the worship. And I read that the men were sitting on one side, the women were on the other side, and the wives were going, "Honey, what did he mean?" and screaming out to their husband. Now,
And you can see where that would be a little,
that
add
to
to the,
me would put it in perspective as he's talking about speaking in tongues and prophesying, not taking turns, and not an orderly worship.
Yes.
Is the way I looked at
yes, so,
it. So,
and I
for
think,
me,
no, I think that, and I'm going to do nothing to try to quell your speaking up, Miss Carol. I for one appreciate it. But I think comment that she made kind of speaks to the fact that this is definitely in the context of everything we're looking at in 1 Corinthians 14. And we've already talked about all the issues in the worship in 1 Corinthians 14, and one of them in some way was that there were clearly some women that were adding to the chaos and the confusion and the disorder there in Corinth. So there's a couple of, in addition to what Carol said, there's a couple of other things to think about here. There are many who would say that this silence has to do with tongue speaking only. I'm not sure that I buy that, but that's something that you will certainly read in the context of this. That's what Paul was trying to get across. And there are other verses, and Ron noted one of them. You know, there are certainly New Testament examples of the fact that women are singing in the public assembly. That it's not even praying. I think in some other verses. So how do you compare this with things that you read like in 1 Timothy chapter 2 about women teaching? How do you put all this together into something that makes sense?
Assembly versus class.
So there's.
Is it? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a question.
That is a very fair question. So Paul says, is there a difference between a worship assembly and a Bible study assembly? So that's a very fair question. Is there?
Think of it like your dad said in terms of authority and headship. And so if I'm speaking in a way that's going to teach a man or exercise some kind of authority over a man, that's not permitted. But in places where the elders have said that, Bible class, for example, or teaching children, or in ways that don't usurp any authority, singing, that's different in my mind than what this is talking about. So I don't have the right to stand up and give a sermon, but in a Bible class where the elders have kind of decided that it's more of a group discussion, then that's kind of a different setting.
Yes. And yes, sir.
I just was going to say, is it not the case that women were recipients of gifts of the Holy Spirit?
Certainly appears to be, yes.
Yeah. So when you have prophetesses and you have others that have this ability, so
Yes.
this would clearly be a contradiction of the ability that these women had in their role, whatever they do, if they were just completely not saying anything.
Yes.
But because this verse is right in the context to let there not be confusion,
Yes.
I think we have to infer that there was, and even though, again, I think there is a connection here, because among Jews, in the synagogue, women cannot read, they could not speak, they were to inquire what the law meant at home with their husbands. That was very much a Jewish concept.
Mm-hmm.
But he seems to be making a statement in the context of there being confusion, although it's not clear.
Yes. And, I think it's important to try to tie the passage from Timothy in here. What is the right role? Are we teaching one another when we're singing? Of course we are, right? That's the whole point. Teaching and admonishing one another. And so if we're saying, hey, women can in no way, in no circumstance, ever do anything that teaches a man, then we got another singing problem. Because that's the whole point. of singing to one another. But the authority or taking a leadership role certainly appears, at least that's the way that I can make sense, personally, I can make sense of this. Yes, sir.
And it's not the part about it being the prohibition against tongue speaking, I think makes some sense in this context of if, we've talked about how that was kind of an abused concept of, anybody can make up a tongue and pretend to be, given this gift, and it almost seems to me as if maybe that was also being used as an excuse to usurp authority, to create an excuse to take on those roles in the church and in the worship.
Yes.
With the excuse of, well, I was given this gift, so obviously I need to use it.
Yes.
And so I agree that it's not saying that, exclusively this is the only thing that women should do, but it's saying that, you're abusing this as an excuse, and not even getting into all the other authority issues in that moment.
Yes. This church and any other one that I've ever been to would be significantly weaker and less valuable if women weren't teaching. And so, like, I think clearly in context of what you're talking about, quietness rather than silence is maybe a better translation there. In a quiet and orderly way, like Paul was talking about to Timothy, in a way that doesn't take authority or leadership in the worship. If there's any other questions about this, John will be sure to clear them up on Wednesday, first thing. So I would not hesitate to bring up any concerns at that time. But we'll move on to lesson 8, and he'll be tackling that. Thanks everybody for their thoughts.